KaraokeBooks.
The Queen of Spades. Written by Aleksandr Pushkin. Introduction by Daniel Pratt. Translated by Sutherland Edwards. Illustrations by Ivan Kramskoy.
Introduction. Although Pushkin is best known for his poetry, he switched to writing prose almost exclusively in the years before his death in a duel in 1837. Written in 1834, The Queen of Spades shows Pushkin at his storytelling best. In a fairly sparse narrative, Pushkin conveys the deep emotions and drives of his characters. Hermann, a bourgeois ethnic German in the Russian army, surrounds himself with the opulent Russian aristocracy. He begins the novel wary of gambling, knowing that he does not have the funds to lose at the card table. After hearing of a secret method of winning at faro, however, he becomes obsessed with the game, willing to do anything to win, with no regard to life and death. The story has become so famous due to the emotional tension and unresolved supernatural elements. Dostoevsky called it the pinnacle of the art of the fantastic, and Tchaikovsky would later create one of his most famous operas based on it. The story remains a powerful critique of greed and ambition to this day.
Chapter 1. There was a card party at the rooms of Narumov, a lieutenant in the Horse Guards. A long winter night had passed unnoticed, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning when supper was served. The winners sat down to table with an excellent appetite. The losers let their plates remain empty before them. Little by little, however, with the assistance of the champagne, the conversation became animated, and was shared by all. "How did you get on this evening, Surin?" said the host to one of his friends. "Oh, I lost, as usual. I really have no luck. I play Mirandole. You know that I keep cool. Nothing moves me. I never change my play, and yet I always lose." "Do you mean to say that all the evening you did not once back the red? Your firmness of character surprises me. What do you think of Hermann?" said one of the party, pointing to a young engineer officer. "That fellow never made a bet or touched a card in his life, and yet he watches us playing until 5 in the morning." "It interests me," said Hermann, "but I am not disposed to risk the necessary in view of the superfluous." "Hermann is a German, and economical. That is the whole of the secret," cried Tomsky. "But what is really astonishing is the Countess Anna Fedotovna." "How so?" asked several voices. "Have you not remarked," said Tomsky, "that she never plays?" "Yes," said Narumov, "a woman of 80, who never touches a card. That is indeed something extraordinary." "You do not know why?" "No, is there a reason for it?" "Just listen. My grandmother, you know, some 60 years ago, went to Paris, and became the rage there. People ran after her in the streets, and called her the Muscovite Venus. Richelieu made love to her, and my grandmother makes out that, by her rigorous demeanor, she almost drove him to suicide. In those days women used to play at faro. One evening at the court she lost, on parole, to the Duke of Orleans, a very considerable sum. When she got home, my grandmother removed her beauty spots, took off her hoops, and in this tragic costume went to my grandfather, told him of her misfortune, and asked him for the money she had to pay. My grandfather, now no more, was, so to say, his wife's steward. He feared her like fire, but the sum she named made him leap into the air. He flew into a rage, made a brief calculation, and proved to my grandmother that in 6 months she had got through 500,000 rubles. He told her plainly that he had no villages to sell in Paris, his domains being situated in the neighborhood of Moscow and of Saratov, and finally refused point blank. You may imagine the fury of my grandmother. She boxed his ears, and passed the night in another room. The next day she returned to the charge. For the first time in her life, she condescended to arguments and explanations. In vain did she try to prove to her husband that there were debts and debts, and that she could not treat a prince of the blood like her coachmaker. All this eloquence was lost. My grandfather was inflexible. My grandmother did not know where to turn. Happily she was acquainted with a man who was very celebrated at this time. You have heard of the Count of Saint-Germain, about whom so many marvelous stories were told. You know that he passed for a sort of wandering Jew, and that he was said to possess an elixir of life and the philosopher's stone. Some people laughed at him as a charlatan. Casanova, in his memoirs, says that he was a spy. However that may be, in spite of the mystery of his life, Saint-Germain was much sought after in good society, and was really an agreeable man. Even to this day my grandmother has preserved a genuine affection for him, and she becomes quite angry when anyone speaks of him with disrespect. It occurred to her that he might be able to advance the sum of which she was in need, and she wrote a note begging him to call. The old magician came at once, and found her plunged in the deepest despair. In 2 or 3 words she told him everything, related to him her misfortune and the cruelty of her husband, adding that she had no hope except in his friendship and his obliging disposition. "Madam," said Saint-Germain, after a few moments' reflection, "I could easily advance you the money you want, but I am sure that you would have no rest until you had repaid me, and I do not want to get you out of one trouble in order to place you in another. There is another way of settling the matter. You must regain the money you have lost." "But, my dear friend," answered my grandmother, "I have already told you that I have nothing left." "That does not matter," answered Saint-Germain. "Listen to me, and I will explain." He then communicated to her a secret which any of you would, I am sure, give a good deal to possess. All the young officers gave their full attention. Tomsky stopped to light his Turkish pipe, swallowed a mouthful of smoke, and then went on. That very evening my grandmother went to Versailles to play at the Queen's table. The Duke of Orleans held the bank. My grandmother invented a little story by way of excuse for not having paid her debt, and then sat down at the table, and began to stake. She took 3 cards. She won with the first, doubled her stake on the second, and won again, doubled on the third, and still won. "Mere luck," said one of the young officers. "What a tale!" cried Hermann. "Were the cards marked?" said a third. "I don't think so," replied Tomsky, gravely. "And you mean to say," exclaimed Narumov, "that you have a grandmother who knows the names of 3 winning cards, and you have never made her tell them to you?" "That is the very deuce of it," answered Tomsky. "She had 3 sons, of whom my father was one. All 3 were determined gamblers, and not one of them was able to extract her secret from her, though it would have been of immense advantage to them, and to me also. Listen to what my uncle told me about it, Count Ivan Ilyich, and he told me on his word of honor. Chaplitsky, the one you remember who died in poverty after devouring millions, lost one day, when he was a young man, to Zorich about 300,000 rubles. He was in despair. My grandmother, who had no mercy for the extravagance of young men, made an exception, I do not know why, in favor of Chaplitsky. She gave him 3 cards, telling him to play them one after the other, and exacting from him at the same time his word of honor that he would never afterwards touch a card as long as he lived. Accordingly Chaplitsky went to Zorich and asked for his revenge. On the first card he staked 50,000 rubles. He won, doubled the stake, and won again. Continuing his system he ended by gaining more than he had lost. But it is 6 o'clock. It is really time to go to bed. Everyone emptied his glass and the party broke up.
Chapter 2. The old Countess A. was seated in her dressing room in front of her looking-glass. 3 waiting maids stood around her. One held a small pot of rouge, another a box of hairpins, and the third a tall can with bright red ribbons. The Countess had no longer the slightest pretensions to beauty, but she still preserved the habits of her youth, dressed in strict accordance with the fashion of 70 years before, and made as long and as careful a toilette as she would have done 60 years previously. Near the window, at an embroidery frame, sat a young lady, her ward. "Good morning, grandmamma," said a young officer, entering the room. "Bonjour, Mademoiselle Lise. Grandmamma, I want to ask you something." "What is it, Paul?" "I want you to let me introduce one of my friends to you, and to allow me to bring him to the ball on Friday. Bring him direct to the ball and introduce him to me there. Were you at B.S. yesterday?" "Yes. Everything went off very pleasantly, and dancing was kept up until 5 o'clock. How charming Yeletskaya was." "But, my dear, what is there charming about her? Isn't she like her grandmother, the Princess Daria Petrovna? By the way, she must be very old, the Princess Daria Petrovna." "How do you mean, old?" cried Tomsky thoughtlessly. "She died 7 years ago." The young lady raised her head and made a sign to the young officer. He then remembered that the old countess was never to be informed of the death of any of her contemporaries, and he bit his lips. But the old countess heard the news with the greatest indifference. "Dead," said she, "and I did not know it. We were appointed maids of honor at the same time, and when we were presented to the Empress." And the Countess for the 100th time related to her grandson one of her anecdotes. "Come, Paul," said she, when she had finished her story, "help me to get up. Lizanka, where is my snuff-box?" And the Countess with her 3 maids went behind a screen to finish her toilette. Tomsky was left alone with the young lady. "Who is the gentleman you wish to introduce to the Countess?" asked Lizavetta Ivanovna in a whisper. "Narumov. Do you know him?" "No. Is he a soldier or a civilian?" "A soldier." "Is he in the engineers?" "No, in the cavalry." "What made you think that he was in the engineers?" The young lady smiled, but made no reply. "Paul," cried the Countess from behind the screen, "send me some new novel. Only pray don't let it be one of the present-day style." "What do you mean, grandmother?" "That is, a novel, in which the hero strangles neither his father nor his mother, and in which there are no drowned bodies. I have a great horror of drowned persons. There are no such novels nowadays. Would you like a Russian one? Are there any Russian novels? Send me one, my dear, pray send me one. Goodbye, grandmother. I am in a hurry. Goodbye, Lizavetta Ivanovna. What made you think that Narumov was in the engineers?" And Tomsky left the boudoir. Lizavetta Ivanovna was left alone. She laid aside her work and began to look out of the window. A few moments afterwards, at a corner house on the other side of the street, a young officer appeared. A deep blush covered her cheeks. She took up her work again and bent her head down over the frame. At the same moment the Countess returned completely dressed. "Order the carriage, Lizavetta," said she. "We will go out for a drive." Lizavetta arose from the frame and began to arrange her work. "What is the matter with you, my child? Are you deaf?" cried the Countess. "Order the carriage to be got ready at once." "I will do so this moment," replied the young lady, hastening into the anteroom. A servant entered and gave the Countess some books from Prince Paul Alexandrovitch. "Tell him that I am much obliged to him," said the Countess. "Lizavetta. Lizavetta. Where are you running to?" "I am going to dress." "There is plenty of time, my dear. Sit down here. Open the first volume and read to me aloud." Her companion took the book and read a few lines. "Louder," said the Countess. "What is the matter with you, my child? Have you lost your voice? Wait. Give me that footstool, a little nearer, that will do." Lizavetta read 2 more pages. The Countess yawned. "Put the book down," said she. "What a lot of nonsense. Send it back to Prince Paul with my thanks. But where is the carriage?" The carriage is ready, said Lizavetta, looking out into the street. How is it that you are not dressed? Said the Countess. I must always wait for you. It is intolerable, my dear. Liza hastened to her room. She had not been there 2 minutes, before the Countess began to ring with all her might. The 3 waiting maids came running in at one door and the valet at another. How is it that you cannot hear me when I ring for you? Said the Countess. Tell Lizavetta Ivanovna that I am waiting for her. Lizavetta returned with her hat and cloak on. At last you are here, said the Countess. But why such an elaborate toilette? Whom do you intend to captivate? What sort of weather is it? It seems rather windy. No, your ladyship, it is very calm, replied the valet. You never think of what you are talking about. Open the window. So it is. Windy and bitterly cold. Unharness the horses. Lizavetta, we won't go out. There was no need for you to deck yourself like that. What a life is mine, thought Lizavetta Ivanovna. And, in truth, Lizavetta Ivanovna was a very unfortunate creature. The bread of the stranger is bitter, says Dante, and his staircase hard to climb. But who can know what the bitterness of dependence is so well as the poor companion of an old lady of quality? The Countess A. had by no means a bad heart, but she was capricious, like a woman who had been spoilt by the world, as well as being avaricious and egotistical, like all old people who have seen their best days, and whose thoughts are with the past and not the present. She participated in all the vanities of the great world, went to balls, where she sat in a corner, painted and dressed in old-fashioned style, like a deformed but indispensable ornament of the ballroom. All the guests on entering approached her and made a profound bow, as if in accordance with a set ceremony, but after that nobody took any further notice of her. She received the whole town at her house, and observed the strictest etiquette, although she could no longer recognize the faces of people. Her numerous domestics, growing fat and old in her ante-chamber and servants' hall, did just as they liked, and vied with each other in robbing the aged Countess in the most bare-faced manner. Lizavetta Ivanovna was the martyr of the household. She made tea, and was reproached with using too much sugar. She read novels aloud to the Countess, and the faults of the author were visited upon her head. She accompanied the Countess in her walks, and was held answerable for the weather or the state of the pavement. A salary was attached to the post, but she very rarely received it, although she was expected to dress like everybody else, that is to say, like very few indeed. In society she played the most pitiable role. Everybody knew her, and nobody paid her any attention. At balls she danced only when a partner was wanted, and ladies would only take hold of her arm when it was necessary to lead her out of the room to attend to their dresses. She was very self-conscious, and felt her position keenly, and she looked about her with impatience for a deliverer to come to her rescue. But the young men, calculating in their giddiness, honored her with but very little attention, although Lizavetta Ivanovna was 100 times prettier than the bare-faced and cold-hearted marriageable girls around whom they hovered. Many a time did she quietly slink away from the glittering but wearisome drawing-room, to go and cry in her own poor little room, in which stood a screen, a chest of drawers, a looking-glass and a painted bedstead, and where a tallow candle burnt feebly in a copper candlestick. One morning, this was about 2 days after the evening party described at the beginning of this story, and a week previous to the scene at which we have just assisted, Lizavetta Ivanova was seated near the window at her embroidery frame, when, happening to look out into the street, she caught sight of a young engineer officer, standing motionless with his eyes fixed upon her window. She lowered her head and went on again with her work. About 5 minutes afterwards she looked out again. The young officer was still standing in the same place. Not being in the habit of coquetting with passing officers, she did not continue to gaze out into the street, but went on sewing for a couple of hours, without raising her head. Dinner was announced. She rose up and began to put her embroidery away, but glancing casually out of the window, she perceived the officer again. This seemed to her very strange. After dinner she went to the window with a certain feeling of uneasiness, but the officer was no longer there, and she thought no more about him. A couple of days afterwards, just as she was stepping into the carriage with the Countess, she saw him again. He was standing close behind the door, with his face half concealed by his fur collar, but his dark eyes sparkled beneath his cap. Lizavetta felt alarmed, though she knew not why, and she trembled as she seated herself in the carriage. On returning home, she hastened to the window. The officer was standing in his accustomed place, with his eyes fixed upon her. She drew back, a prey to curiosity and agitated by a feeling which was quite new to her. From that time forward not a day passed without the young officer making his appearance under the window at the customary hour, and between him and her there was established a sort of mute acquaintance. Sitting in her place at work, she used to feel his approach, and raising her head, she would look at him longer and longer each day. The young man seemed to be very grateful to her. She saw with the sharp eye of youth how a sudden flush covered his pale cheeks each time that their glances met. After about a week she commenced to smile at him. When Tomsky asked permission of his grandmother the Countess to present one of his friends to her, the young girl's heart beat violently. But hearing that Narumov was not an engineer, she regretted that by her thoughtless question, she had betrayed her secret to the volatile Tomsky. Hermann was the son of a German who had become a naturalized Russian, and from whom he had inherited a small capital. Being firmly convinced of the necessity of preserving his independence, Hermann did not touch his private income, but lived on his pay, without allowing himself the slightest luxury. Moreover, he was reserved and ambitious, and his companions rarely had an opportunity of making merry at the expense of his extreme parsimony. He had strong passions and an ardent imagination, but his firmness of disposition preserved him from the ordinary errors of young men. Thus, though a gamester at heart, he never touched a card, for he considered his position did not allow him, as he said, to risk the necessary in the hope of winning the superfluous. Yet he would sit for nights together at the card table and follow with feverish anxiety the different turns of the game. The story of the three cards had produced a powerful impression upon his imagination, and all night long he could think of nothing else. If, he thought to himself the following evening, as he walked along the streets of St. Petersburg, if the old Countess would but reveal her secret to me, if she would only tell me the names of the three winning cards. Why should I not try my fortune? I must get introduced to her and win her favor, become her lover. But all that will take time, and she is 87 years old. She might be dead in a week, in a couple of days even. But the story itself, can it really be true? No. Economy, temperance and industry. Those are my three winning cards. By means of them I shall be able to double my capital, increase it sevenfold, and procure for myself ease and independence. Musing in this manner, he walked on until he found himself in one of the principal streets of St. Petersburg, in front of a house of antiquated architecture. The street was blocked with equipages. Carriages one after the other drew up in front of the brilliantly illuminated doorway. At one moment there stepped out onto the pavement the well-shaped little foot of some young beauty, at another the heavy boot of a cavalry officer, and then the silk stockings and shoes of a member of the diplomatic world. Furs and cloaks passed in rapid succession before the gigantic porter at the entrance. Hermann stopped. "Whose house is this?" he asked of the watchman at the corner. "The Countess A.S.," replied the watchman. Hermann started. The strange story of the three cards again presented itself to his imagination. He began walking up and down before the house, thinking of its owner and her strange secret. Returning late to his modest lodging, he could not go to sleep for a long time, and when at last he did doze off, He could dream of nothing but cards, green tables, piles of banknotes and heaps of ducats. He played one card after the other, winning uninterruptedly, and then he gathered up the gold and filled his pockets with the notes. When he woke up late the next morning, he sighed over the loss of his imaginary wealth, and then sallying out into the town, he found himself once more in front of the Countess's residence. Some unknown power seemed to have attracted him thither. He stopped and looked up at the windows. At one of these he saw a head with luxuriant black hair, which was bent down probably over some book or an embroidery frame. The head was raised. Hermann saw a fresh complexion and a pair of dark eyes. That moment decided his fate.
Chapter 3. Lizavetta Ivanovna had scarcely taken off her hat and cloak, when the Countess sent for her and again ordered her to get the carriage ready. The vehicle drew up before the door, and they prepared to take their seats. Just at the moment when two footmen were assisting the old lady to enter the carriage, Lizavetta saw her engineer standing close beside the wheel. He grasped her hand. Alarm caused her to lose her presence of mind, and the young man disappeared, but not before he had left a letter between her fingers. She concealed it in her glove, and during the whole of the drive she neither saw nor heard anything. It was the custom of the Countess, when out for an airing in her carriage, to be constantly asking such questions as, "Who was that person that met us just now? What is the name of this bridge? What is written on that signboard?" On this occasion, however, Lisavetta returned such vague and absurd answers, that the Countess became angry with her. "What is the matter with you, my dear?" she exclaimed. "Have you taken leave of your senses, or what is it? Do you not hear me or understand what I say? Heaven be thanked, I am still in my right mind and speak plainly enough." Lizavetta Ivanovna did not hear her. On returning home she ran to her room, and drew the letter out of her glove. It was not sealed. Lizavetta read it. The letter contained a declaration of love. It was tender, respectful, and copied word for word from a German novel. But Lizavetta did not know anything of the German language, and she was quite delighted. For all that, the letter caused her to feel exceedingly uneasy. For the first time in her life she was entering into secret and confidential relations with a young man. His boldness alarmed her. She reproached herself for her imprudent behavior, and knew not what to do. Should she cease to sit at the window and, by assuming an appearance of indifference towards him, put a check upon the young officer's desire for further acquaintance with her? Should she send his letter back to him, or should she answer him in a cold and decided manner? There was nobody to whom she could turn in her perplexity, for she had neither female friend nor adviser. At length she resolved to reply to him. She sat down at her little writing table, took pen and paper, and began to think. Several times she began her letter, and then tore it up. The way she had expressed herself seemed to her either too inviting or too cold and decisive. At last she succeeded in writing a few lines with which she felt satisfied. "I am convinced," she wrote, "that your intentions are honorable, and that you do not wish to offend me by any imprudent behavior, but our acquaintance must not begin in such a manner. I return you your letter, and I hope that I shall never have any cause to complain of this undeserved slight." The next day, as soon as Hermann made his appearance, Lizavetta rose from her embroidery, went into the drawing-room, opened the ventilator and threw the letter into the street, trusting that the young officer would have the perception to pick it up. Hermann hastened forward, picked it up and then repaired to a confectioner's shop. Breaking the seal of the envelope, he found inside it his own letter and Lizavetta's reply. He had expected this, and he returned home, his mind deeply occupied with his intrigue. 3 days afterwards, a bright-eyed young girl from a milliner's establishment brought Lizavetta a letter. Lizavetta opened it with great uneasiness, fearing that it was a demand for money, when suddenly she recognized Hermann's handwriting. "You have made a mistake, my dear," said she. "This letter is not for me." "Oh, yes, it is for you," replied the girl, smiling very knowingly. "Have the goodness to read it." Lizavetta glanced at the letter. Herman requested an interview. "It cannot be," she cried, alarmed at the audacious request, and the manner in which it was made. "This letter is certainly not for me." And she tore it into fragments. "If the letter was not for you, why have you torn it up?" said the girl. "I should have given it back to the person who sent it." "Be good enough, my dear," said Lisavetta, disconcerted by this remark, "not to bring me any more letters for the future, and tell the person who sent you that he ought to be ashamed." But Herman was not the man to be thus put off. Every day Lizavetta received from him a letter, sent now in this way, now in that. They were no longer translated from the German. Herman wrote them under the inspiration of passion, and spoke in his own language, and they bore full testimony to the inflexibility of his desire and the disordered condition of his uncontrollable imagination. Lizavetta no longer thought of sending them back to him. She became intoxicated with them and began to reply to them, and little by little her answers became longer and more affectionate. At last she threw out of the window to him the following letter. "This evening there is going to be a ball at the embassy. The Countess will be there. We shall remain until 2 o'clock. You have now an opportunity of seeing me alone. As soon as the Countess is gone, the servants will very probably go out, and there will be nobody left but the Swiss, but he usually goes to sleep in his lodge. Come about 11:30. Walk straight upstairs. If you meet anybody in the anteroom, ask if the Countess is at home. You will be told, no, in which case there will be nothing left for you to do but to go away again. But it is most probable that you will meet nobody. The maid servants will all be together in one room. On leaving the anteroom, turn to the left, and walk straight on until you reach the Countess's bedroom. In the bedroom, behind a screen, you will find 2 doors. The one on the right leads to a cabinet, which the Countess never enters. The one on the left leads to a corridor, at the end of which is a little winding staircase. This leads to my room." Herman trembled like a tiger, as he waited for the appointed time to arrive. At 10 o'clock in the evening he was already in front of the Countess's house. The weather was terrible. The wind blew with great violence. The sleety snow fell in large flakes. The lamps emitted a feeble light. The streets were deserted. From time to time a sledge, drawn by a sorry-looking hack, passed by, on the lookout for a belated passenger. Herman was enveloped in a thick overcoat, and felt neither wind nor snow. At last the Countess's carriage drew up. Herman saw 2 footmen carry out in their arms the bent form of the old lady, wrapped in sable fur, and immediately behind her clad in a warm mantle, and with her head ornamented with a wreath of fresh flowers, followed Lizavetta. The door was closed. The carriage rolled away heavily through the yielding snow. The porter shut the street door. The windows became dark. Herman began walking up and down near the deserted house. At length he stopped under a lamp, and glanced at his watch. It was 20 minutes past 11. He remained standing under the lamp, his eyes fixed upon the watch, impatiently waiting for the remaining minutes to pass. At 11:30 precisely, Herman ascended the steps of the house, and made his way into the brightly illuminated vestibule. The porter was not there. Herman hastily ascended the staircase, opened the door of the anteroom and saw a footman sitting asleep in an antique chair by the side of a lamp. With a light firm step Herman passed by him. The drawing-room and dining-room were in darkness, but a feeble reflection penetrated thither from the lamp in the anteroom. Herman reached the Countess's bedroom. Before a shrine, which was full of old images, a golden lamp was burning. Faded stuffed chairs and divans with soft cushions stood in melancholy symmetry around the room, the walls of which were hung with China silk. On one side of the room hung 2 portraits painted in Paris by Madame Lebrun. One of these represented a stout, red-faced man of about 40 years of age in a bright green uniform and with a star upon his breast. The other, a beautiful young woman, with an aquiline nose, forehead curls and a rose in her powdered hair. In the corners stood porcelain shepherds and shepherdesses, dining-room clocks from the workshop of the celebrated Lefroy, bandboxes, roulettes, fans and the various playthings for the amusement of ladies that were in vogue at the end of the last century, when Montgolfier's balloons and Mesmer's magnetism were the rage. Hermann stepped behind the screen. At the back of it stood a little iron bedstead. On the right was the door which led to the cabinet, on the left, the other which led to the corridor. He opened the latter, and saw the little winding staircase which led to the room of the poor companion. But he retraced his steps and entered the dark cabinet. The time passed slowly. All was still. The clock in the drawing-room struck 12. The strokes echoed through the room one after the other, and everything was quiet again. Hermann stood leaning against the cold stove. He was calm. His heart beat regularly, like that of a man resolved upon a dangerous but inevitable undertaking. 1 o'clock in the morning struck, then 2, and he heard the distant noise of carriage wheels. An involuntary agitation took possession of him. The carriage drew near and stopped. He heard the sound of the carriage steps being let down. All was bustle within the house. The servants were running hither and thither, there was a confusion of voices, and the rooms were lit up. 3 antiquated chambermaids entered the bedroom, and they were shortly afterwards followed by the Countess who, more dead than alive, sank into a Voltaire armchair. Hermann peeped through a chink. Lizavetta Ivanovna passed close by him, and he heard her hurried steps as she hastened up the little spiral staircase. For a moment his heart was assailed by something like a pricking of conscience, but the emotion was only transitory, and his heart became petrified as before. The Countess began to undress before her looking-glass. Her rose-bedecked cap was taken off, and then her powdered wig was removed from off her white and closely cut hair. Hairpins fell in showers around her. Her yellow satin dress, brocaded with silver, fell down at her swollen feet. Hermann was a witness of the repugnant mysteries of her toilette. At last the Countess was in her nightcap and dressing gown, and in this costume, more suitable to her age, she appeared less hideous and deformed. Like all old people in general, the Countess suffered from sleeplessness. Having undressed, she seated herself at the window in a Voltaire armchair and dismissed her maids. The candles were taken away, and once more the room was left with only one lamp burning in it. The Countess sat there looking quite yellow, mumbling with her flaccid lips and swaying to and fro. Her dull eyes expressed complete vacancy of mind, and, looking at her, one would have thought that the rocking of her body was not a voluntary action of her own, but was produced by the action of some concealed galvanic mechanism. Suddenly the death-like face assumed an inexplicable expression. The lips ceased to tremble, the eyes became animated. Before the Countess stood an unknown man. "Do not be alarmed, for heaven's sake, do not be alarmed," said he in a low but distinct voice. "I have no intention of doing you any harm, I have only come to ask a favor of you." The old woman looked at him in silence, as if she had not heard what he had said. Hermann thought that she was deaf, and, bending down towards her ear, he repeated what he had said. The aged Countess remained silent as before. "You can ensure the happiness of my life," continued Hermann, "and it will cost you nothing. I know that you can name 3 cards in order." Hermann stopped. The Countess appeared now to understand what he wanted. She seemed as if seeking words to reply. "It was a joke," she replied at last. "I assure you it was only a joke." "There is no joking about the matter," replied Hermann angrily. "Remember Chaplitsky, whom you helped to win." The Countess became visibly uneasy. Her features expressed strong emotion, but they quickly resumed their former immobility. "Can you not name me these 3 winning cards?" continued Hermann. The Countess remained silent. Hermann continued. "For whom are you preserving your secret? For your grandsons? They are rich enough without it. They do not know the worth of money. Your cards would be of no use to a spendthrift. He who cannot preserve his paternal inheritance, will die in want, even though he had a demon at his service. I am not a man of that sort. I know the value of money. Your 3 cards will not be thrown away upon me. Come." He paused and tremblingly awaited her reply. The Countess remained silent. Hermann fell upon his knees. "If your heart has ever known the feeling of love," said he, "if you remember its rapture, if you have ever smiled at the cry of your newborn child, if any human feeling has ever entered into your breast, I entreat you by the feelings of a wife, a lover, a mother, by all that is most sacred in life, not to reject my prayer. Reveal to me your secret. Of what use is it to you? May be if as connected with some terrible sin, with the loss of eternal salvation, with some bargain with the devil. Reflect, you are old. You have not long to live. I am ready to take your sins upon my soul. Only reveal to me your secret. Remember that the happiness of a man is in your hands, that not only I, but my children, and grandchildren will bless your memory and reverence you as a saint." The old Countess answered not a word. Hermann rose to his feet. "You old hag!" he exclaimed, grinding his teeth, "then I will make you answer." With these words he drew a pistol from his pocket. At the sight of the pistol, the Countess for the second time exhibited strong emotion. She shook her head and raised her hands as if to protect herself from the shot. Then she fell backwards and remained motionless. "Come, an end to this childish nonsense," said Hermann, taking hold of her hand. "I ask you for the last time, will you tell me the names of your 3 cards, or will you not?" The Countess made no reply. Hermann perceived that she was dead.
Chapter 4. Lizavetta Ivanovna was sitting in her room, still in her ball dress, lost in deep thought. On returning home, she had hastily dismissed the chambermaid who very reluctantly came forward to assist her, saying that she would undress herself, and with a trembling heart had gone up to her own room, expecting to find Hermann there, but yet hoping not to find him. At the first glance she convinced herself that he was not there, and she thanked her fate for having prevented him keeping the appointment. She sat down without undressing, and began to recall to mind all the circumstances which in so short a time had carried her so far. It was not 3 weeks since the time when she first saw the young officer from the window, and yet she was already in correspondence with him, and he had succeeded in inducing her to grant him a nocturnal interview. She knew his name only through his having written it at the bottom of some of his letters. She had never spoken to him, had never heard his voice, and had never heard him spoken of until that evening. But, strange to say, that very evening at the ball, Tomsky, being piqued with the young Princess Pauline N., who, contrary to her usual custom, did not flirt with him, wished to revenge himself by assuming an air of indifference. He therefore engaged Lizavetta Ivanovna and danced an endless mazurka with her. During the whole of the time he kept teasing her about her partiality for engineer officers. He assured her that he knew far more than she imagined, and some of his jests were so happily aimed, that Lizavetta thought several times that her secret was known to him. "From whom have you learned all this?" she asked, smiling. "From a friend of a person very well known to you," replied Tomsky, "from a very distinguished man." "And who is this distinguished man?" "His name is Hermann." Lizavetta made no reply, but her hands and feet lost all sense of feeling. "This Hermann," continued Tomsky, "is a man of romantic personality. He has the profile of a Napoleon, and the soul of a Mephistopheles. I believe that he has at least 3 crimes upon his conscience. How pale you have become. I have a headache. But what did this Herman, or whatever his name is, tell you? Herman is very much dissatisfied with his friend. He says that in his place he would act very differently. I even think that Herman himself has designs upon you. At least, he listens very attentively to all that his friend has to say about you. And where has he seen me? In church, perhaps, or on the parade. God alone knows where. It may have been in your room, while you were asleep, for there is nothing that he. 3 ladies approaching him with the question. Oubliez you regret? Interrupted the conversation, which had become so tantalizingly interesting to Lizavetta. The lady chosen by Tomsky was the Princess Pauline herself. She succeeded in effecting a reconciliation with him during the numerous turns of the dance, after which he conducted her to her chair. On returning to his place, Tomsky thought no more either of Herman or Lizavetta. She longed to renew the interrupted conversation, but the mazurka came to an end, and shortly afterwards the old countess took her departure. Tomsky's words were nothing more than the customary small talk of the dance, but they sank deep into the soul of the young dreamer. The portrait, sketched by Tomsky, coincided with the picture she had formed within her own mind, and thanks to the latest romances, the ordinary countenance of her admirer became invested with attributes capable of alarming her and fascinating her imagination at the same time. She was now sitting with her bare arms crossed and with her head, still adorned with flowers, sunk upon her uncovered bosom. Suddenly the door opened and Herman entered. She shuddered. "Where were you?" she asked in a terrified whisper. "In the old countess's bedroom," replied Herman. "I have just left her. The countess is dead." "My God! What do you say?" "And I am afraid," added Herman, "that I am the cause of her death." Lisavetta looked at him, and Tomsky's words found an echo in her soul. This man has at least 3 crimes upon his conscience. Herman sat down by the window near her, and related all that had happened. Lizavetta listened to him in terror. So all those passionate letters, those ardent desires, this bold obstinate pursuit, all this was not love. Money. That was what his soul yearned for. She could not satisfy his desire and make him happy. The poor girl had been nothing but the blind tool of a robber, of the murderer of her aged benefactress. She wept bitter tears of agonized repentance. Herman gazed at her in silence. His heart, too, was a prey to violent emotion, but neither the tears of the poor girl, nor the wonderful charm of her beauty, enhanced by her grief, could produce any impression upon his hardened soul. He felt no pricking of conscience at the thought of the dead old woman. One thing only grieved him: the irreparable loss of the secret from which he had expected to obtain great wealth. "You are a monster," said Lizavetta at last. "I did not wish for her death," replied Herman. "My pistol was not loaded." Both remained silent. The day began to dawn. Lizavetta extinguished her candle. A pale light illumined her room. She wiped her tear-stained eyes and raised them towards Herman. He was sitting near the window, with his arms crossed and with a fierce frown upon his forehead. In this attitude he bore a striking resemblance to the portrait of Napoleon. This resemblance struck Lizavetta even. "How shall I get you out of the house?" said she at last. "I thought of conducting you down the secret staircase, but in that case it would be necessary to go through the countess's bedroom, and I am afraid. Tell me how to find this secret staircase. I will go alone." Lizavetta arose, took from her drawer a key, handed it to Herman and gave him the necessary instructions. Herman pressed her cold, limp hand, kissed her bowed head, and left the room. He descended the winding staircase, and once more entered the countess's bedroom. The dead old lady sat as if petrified. Her face expressed profound tranquillity. Herman stopped before her, and gazed long and earnestly at her. as if he wished to convince himself of the terrible reality. At last he entered the cabinet, felt behind the tapestry for the door, and then began to descend the dark staircase, filled with strange emotions. Down this very staircase, thought he, perhaps coming from the very same room, and at this very same hour 60 years ago, there may have glided, in an embroidered coat, with his hair dressed à la so royal and pressing to his heart his three-cornered hat, some young gallant, who has long been mouldering in the grave, but the heart of his aged mistress has only today ceased to beat. At the bottom of the staircase Hermann found a door, which he opened with a key, and then traversed a corridor which conducted him into the street.
Chapter 5. 3 days after the fatal night, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Hermann repaired to the convent of, where the last honours were to be paid to the mortal remains of the old countess. Although feeling no remorse, he could not altogether stifle the voice of conscience, which said to him, "You are the murderer of the old woman." In spite of his entertaining very little religious belief, he was exceedingly superstitious, and believing that the dead countess might exercise an evil influence on his life, he resolved to be present at her obsequies in order to implore her pardon. The church was full. It was with difficulty that Hermann made his way through the crowd of people. The coffin was placed upon a rich catafalque beneath a velvet baldachin. The deceased countess lay within it, with her hands crossed upon her breast, with a lace cap upon her head and dressed in a white satin robe. Around the catafalque stood the members of her household. The servants in black caftans, with armorial ribbons upon their shoulders, and candles in their hands. The relatives, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, in deep mourning. Nobody wept. Tears would have been une affectation. The countess was so old, that her death could have surprised nobody, and her relatives had long looked upon her as being out of the world. A famous preacher pronounced the funeral sermon. In simple and touching words he described the peaceful passing away of the righteous, who had passed long years in calm preparation for a Christian end. The angel of death found her, said the orator, engaged in pious meditation and waiting for the midnight bridegroom. The service concluded amidst profound silence. The relatives went forward first to take farewell of the corpse. Then followed the numerous guests, who had come to render the last homage to her who for so many years had been a participator in their frivolous amusements. After these followed the members of the countess's household. The last of these was an old woman of the same age as the deceased. 2 young women led her forward by the hand. She had not strength enough to bow down to the ground, she merely shed a few tears and kissed the cold hand of her mistress. Hermann now resolved to approach the coffin. He knelt down upon the cold stones and remained in that position for some minutes. At last he arose, as pale as the deceased countess herself. He ascended the steps of the catafalque and bent over the corpse. At that moment it seemed to him that the dead woman darted a mocking look at him and winked with one eye. Hermann started back, took a false step and fell to the ground. Several persons hurried forward and raised him up. At the same moment Lizavetta Ivanovna was borne fainting into the porch of the church. This episode disturbed for some minutes the solemnity of the gloomy ceremony. Among the congregation arose a deep murmur, and a tall thin chamberlain, a near relative of the deceased, whispered in the ear of an Englishman who was standing near him, that the young officer was a natural son of the countess, to which the Englishman coldly replied, "Oh." During the whole of that day, Hermann was strangely excited. Repairing to an out-of-the-way restaurant to dine, he drank a great deal of wine, contrary to his usual custom, in the hope of deadening his inward agitation. But the wine only served to excite his imagination still more. On returning home, he threw himself upon his bed without undressing, and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up it was already night, and the moon was shining into the room. He looked at his watch. It was 2:45. Sleep had left him. He sat down upon his bed and thought of the funeral of the old Countess. At that moment somebody in the street looked in at his window, and immediately passed on again. Hermann paid no attention to this incident. A few moments afterwards he heard the door of his anteroom open. Hermann thought that it was his orderly, drunk as usual, returning from some nocturnal expedition, but presently he heard footsteps that were unknown to him. Somebody was walking softly over the floor in slippers. The door opened, and a woman dressed in white entered the room. Hermann mistook her for his old nurse, and wondered what could bring her there at that hour of the night. But the white woman glided rapidly across the room and stood before him, and Hermann recognized the Countess. "I have come to you against my wish," she said in a firm voice, "but I have been ordered to grant your request. 3-7 ace will win for you if played in succession, but only on these conditions: that you do not play more than one card in 24 hours, and that you never play again during the rest of your life. I forgive you my death, on condition that you marry my companion, Lizavetta Ivanovna." With these words she turned round very quietly, walked with a shuffling gait towards the door and disappeared. Hermann heard the street door open and shut, and again he saw some one look in at him through the window. For a long time Hermann could not recover himself. He then rose up and entered the next room. His orderly was lying asleep upon the floor, and he had much difficulty in waking him. The orderly was drunk as usual, and no information could be obtained from him. The street door was locked. Hermann returned to his room, lit his candle, and wrote down all the details of his vision.
Chapter 6. Two fixed ideas can no more exist together in the moral world than two bodies can occupy one and the same place in the physical world. 3-7 ace soon drove out of Hermann's mind the thought of the dead Countess. 3-7 ace were perpetually running through his head and continually being repeated by his lips. If he saw a young girl, he would say, "How slender she is! Quite like the 3 of hearts." If anybody asked, "What is the time?" he would reply, 5 minutes to 7. Every stout man that he saw reminded him of the ace. 3-7 ace haunted him in his sleep, and assumed all possible shapes. The 3s bloomed before him in the forms of magnificent flowers, the 7s were represented by Gothic portals, and the aces became transformed into gigantic spiders. One thought alone occupied his whole mind: to make a profitable use of the secret which he had purchased so dearly. He thought of applying for a furlough so as to travel abroad. He wanted to go to Paris and tempt fortune in some of the public gambling houses that abounded there. Chance spared him all this trouble. There was in Moscow a society of rich gamesters, presided over by the celebrated Chekalinsky, who had passed all his life at the card table and had amassed millions, accepting bills of exchange for his winnings and paying his losses in ready money. His long experience secured for him the confidence of his companions, and his open house, his famous cook, and his agreeable and fascinating manners gained for him the respect of the public. He came to St. Petersburg. The young men of the capital flocked to his rooms, forgetting balls for cards, and preferring the emotions of faro to the seductions of flirting. Narumov conducted Hermann to Chekalinsky's residence. They passed through a suite of magnificent rooms, filled with attentive domestics. The place was crowded. Generals and privy councillors were playing at whist. Young men were lolling carelessly upon the velvet-covered sofas, eating ices and smoking pipes. In the drawing-room, at the head of a long table, around which were assembled about a score of players, sat the master of the house keeping the bank. He was a man of about 60 years of age, of a very dignified appearance. His head was covered with silvery white hair. His full, florid countenance expressed good nature, and his eyes twinkled with a perpetual smile. Narumov introduced Hermann to him. Chekalinsky shook him by the hand in a friendly manner, requested him not to stand on ceremony, and then went on dealing. The game occupied some time. On the table lay more than 30 cards. Chekalinsky paused after each throw, in order to give the players time to arrange their cards and note down their losses, listened politely to their requests, and more politely still, put straight the corners of cards that some player's hand had chanced to bend. At last the game was finished. Chekalinsky shuffled the cards and prepared to deal again. "Will you allow me to take a card?" said Herman, stretching out his hand from behind a stout gentleman who was punting. Chekalinsky smiled and bowed silently, as a sign of acquiescence. Narumov laughingly congratulated Herman on his abjuration of that abstention from cards which he had practiced for so long a period, and wished him a lucky beginning. "Stake," said Herman, writing some figures with chalk on the back of his card. "How much?" asked the banker, contracting the muscles of his eyes. "Excuse me, I cannot see quite clearly." 47,000 rubles, replied Herman. At these words every head in the room turned suddenly round, and all eyes were fixed upon Herman. "He has taken leave of his senses," thought Narumov. "Allow me to inform you," said Chekalinsky, with his eternal smile, "that you are playing very high. Nobody here has ever staked more than 275 rubles at once." "Very well," replied Herman, "but do you accept my card or not?" Chekalinsky bowed in token of consent. "I only wish to observe," said he, "that although I have the greatest confidence in my friends, I can only play against ready money. For my own part, I am quite convinced that your word is sufficient, but for the sake of the order of the game, and to facilitate the reckoning up, I must ask you to put the money on your card." Herman drew from his pocket a banknote and handed it to Chekalinsky, who, after examining it in a cursory manner, placed it on Herman's card. He began to deal. On the right a 9 turned up, and on the left a 3. "I have won," said Herman, showing his card. A murmur of astonishment arose among the players. Chekalinsky frowned, but the smile quickly returned to his face. "Do you wish me to settle with you?" he said to Herman. "If you please," replied the latter. Chekalinsky drew from his pocket a number of banknotes and paid at once. Herman took up his money and left the table. Narumov could not recover from his astonishment. Herman drank a glass of lemonade and returned home. The next evening he again repaired to Chekalinsky's. The host was dealing. Herman walked up to the table. The punters immediately made room for him. Chekalinsky greeted him with a gracious bow. Herman waited for the next deal, took a card and placed upon it his 47,000 rubles, together with his winnings of the previous evening. Chekalinsky began to deal. A knave turned up on the right, a 7 on the left. Herman showed his 7. There was a general exclamation. Chekalinsky was evidently ill at ease, but he counted out the 94,000 rubles and handed them over to Herman, who pocketed them in the coolest manner possible and immediately left the house. The next evening Herman appeared again at the table. Everyone was expecting him. The generals and privy councillors left their whist in order to watch such extraordinary play. The young officers quitted their sofas, and even the servants crowded into the room. All pressed round Herman. The other players left off punting, impatient to see how it would end. Herman stood at the table and prepared to play alone against the pale, but still smiling Chekalinsky. Each opened a pack of cards. Chekalinsky shuffled. Herman took a card and covered it with a pile of banknotes. It was like a duel. Deep silence reigned around. Chekalinsky began to deal. His hands trembled. On the right a queen turned up, and on the left an ace. "Ace has won," cried Herman, showing his card. "Your queen has lost," said Chekalinsky, politely. Herman started. Instead of an ace, there lay before him the queen of spades. He could not believe his eyes. nor could he understand how he had made such a mistake. At that moment it seemed to him that the Queen of Spades smiled ironically and winked her eye at him. He was struck by her remarkable resemblance. "The old Countess!" he exclaimed, seized with terror. Chekalinsky gathered up his winnings. For some time, Hermann remained perfectly motionless. When at last he left the table, there was a general commotion in the room. "Splendidly punted," said the players. Chekalinsky shuffled the cards afresh, and the game went on as usual.
Conclusion. Hermann went out of his mind, and is now confined in room number 17 of the Obakov Hospital. He never answers any questions, but he constantly mutters with unusual rapidity, 3, 7, ace. 3, 7, queen. Lizavetta Ivanovna has married a very amiable young man, a son of the former steward of the Old Countess. He is in the service of the state somewhere, and is in receipt of a good income. Lizavetta is also supporting a poor relative. Tomsky has been promoted to the rank of captain and has become the husband of the Princess Pauline.
KaraokeBooks.